Hello everyone, my name is Chris. I'm an Associate Product Manager here at SAP, and today we're going to dive into aggregations and exception aggregations. We're going to see what they are, how to create them, when to use them, and some examples. So let's get started and jump right on in. So right now, we are in the modeling home screen. You can see that by going to the modeling icon on the top toolbar. And from here, we're going to click on the account dimension to enter our measures, and you'll see all of our measures here. We have 6 measures in this model so far. 2 of them are latitude and longitude, which we won't be using because they are primarily used for geo-enrichment. These bottom 3 measures you can see of customer meetings, order value, and units sold are actually imported from an Excel file, and they have independent data points to go along with it. The last measure of price per unit is actually a calculated measure, which I created in a previous video that you can watch by searching calculated measure on our YouTube channel. So now we're going to go ahead and create a new measure using the plus button in the edit toolbar. We're going to scroll down to the calculations panel. From here, you can see we have this aggregation section with aggregation type, exception aggregation type, and exception aggregation dimension. Now before I go into the aggregation type, I'd like to focus on the exception aggregation type because the aggregation type is sort of layered on top of it, and it would make more sense that you understand the foundation of the exception aggregation before going into the aggregation itself. So I'm going to go one by one and explain what each of these things do, along with an example of when you'd use it. So first, we have sum, which would add all of the values together. Say, for example, you want to find what is your total value of units sold. Then you'd want to use sum. Count would count all of the members within a group, which is different than calculating sum. So say you want to know how many products or SKUs you have in a certain country, then you'd want to use count. Count excluding null and count excluding 0 and null will both do the same thing as count, except they will exclude any values that have null or 0 and null. Minimum will take the minimum value and display it. This might be useful if you want to know what the lowest number of units sold per day is. Maximum will tell you what the maximum value is, and this could be used if you want to know what is your highest cost in recent weeks or months. Average will take the average of all of your aggregated values. So say you want to know what is the average price that a product sells for. If you have a product with a lot of fluctuating prices, then you'd want to use average. In this case, we have a price per unit that fluctuates fairly often, so we're going to apply an average later on. Average excluding null and average excluding 0 and null will do the same thing as average but exclude the null and 0 and null values. First, we'll return the first or oldest value in the selected time period. So say you have a list of contractors and you want to know what was the rate the first time that you hired them. Then you can compare this with subsequent years, and if you use first, it'll return that earliest value. Last, we'll return the latest or most recent value. Say you want to see if a price changes very often in a product and you want to see what is the latest price in a certain year to compare it with other years, you would use last. The remainder of these operations are all statistical operations of quartiles and medians, and they're typically used when you're working with normal distributions, so we're going to go ahead and leave those for today. We want to apply an average in our case. When I apply this average, you'll see that the exception aggregation dimension gets highlighted in red. So we're going to go ahead and click on this icon to open up our dimension panel. What this is asking for, it's asking us what do we want our exception aggregation to be applied over. So say for example, I have this average. Do I want the average for each order? Do I want the average for each sales agent? Do I want the average per country? That is essentially what it's asking. In this case, I want the average for each order. So I'm going to go ahead and select order and click OK. Now let's look at the aggregation type. So there are 4 selections here, but really there are 3 because the default blank one essentially defaults to sum. Now what this does is it's asking you, what do you want us to do on the data before we send it to the exception aggregation? Do you want all the data to be summed and then averaged? Do you want all the data to be left alone with no operation done on it? The different use cases in this case is sum in most instances when you want to add up all of your data. So say for example, we want to find out what the average is. Well, we want to sum up all our data and then apply an average on it. So we're going to leave it as sum in this case. Label would be used when you have something like a hierarchy and you want to leave one of the values as a descriptive value. Essentially, you don't want any calculation to be applied on it, then you'd use label. None will not sum your value. So this is something you'd use when you have data that's already been averaged and you want to apply maybe a first or a last or a minimum or a maximum. Then you don't want that average to be summed, you just want it to be left alone. In this case, we're going to leave it blank because we need a sum. Now we can go ahead and give it a name. In this case, we want to do the average price per unit. So I'm going to select APPU and name it average price per unit. And the last thing we need to do before we complete our measure is we need to give it the actual value to calculate. In this case, we're calculating the average price per unit, so we need to input price per unit. And to make it a little easier to understand how this works, essentially you are taking the exception aggregation type, applying it on this formula value over the dimension. So we are taking the average price per unit for each order. Hopefully, this has given you a bit more information about exception aggregations and aggregations, and we can't wait to see what you will come up with. Thank you.